In this presentation, we will be evaluating all different types of evidence, and this covers chapters 7 and 8. We're going to start off with the scenario of a car accident. When a car accident occurs and a police officer arrives at the scene, the police officer wants to try to find out what exactly happened. And in order to do that, the police officer would have to investigate. Sometimes there are witnesses that were present when the accident occurred, so the police officer would interview them to find out what they saw. If there was a video camera, the police officer could use evidence from what the video camera captured. The police officer will also interview the drivers and find out what happened, what were the drivers doing, what did they see at the moment when the accident occurred. Now, if a lot of these, the information collected from all of these different types of evidence, then the officer would need to determine from these evidence here which evidence is most reliable and trusted. And so in chapters 7 and 8 in our textbook, we are presented with many different types of evidence. And the book talks about what makes some evidence, the book actually talks about what we as critical readers need to be aware of when we look at evidence, because not all evidence are created equally. For example, when we look at the drivers and their testimonies versus the witnesses, who is more reliable? Okay, most of us will probably say the witnesses are more reliable because they are objective, versus the testimonies of the drivers. They will be biased because they are wanting to cover up for themselves. And so let's go ahead and do a or I want to point out some things about chapters 7 and 8 that you may have read already, and I want to emphasize them. So in chapter 7, it talks a little bit about facts and opinions. And when authors write, they will use both facts and opinions in their writing. However, some may use more facts to support the argument, while others may use more opinions to support the argument. Now, most of us would lean towards, oh yeah, facts are good, okay? Yes, generally we prefer facts over opinions. However, when we think about it, the evidence is stronger when it gets closer to fact and farther away from mere opinions. So that is our preference. But one thing I want us to be cautious about is to remember that facts are less powerful and accurate than they seem from afar also. So all it's saying is that, in other words, just because it is a fact, it doesn't mean that it is gold and we should just believe it, okay? And so be very aware of that. Yes, it's stronger if it's a fact rather than an opinion, but just because it's a fact doesn't mean that we should just take it as it is and go with it. As critical thinkers in these chapters, we're going to look at the different types of quote-unquote facts that authors use to support the argument, and how some of these facts are sometimes not very strong facts that we can rely on. Now, critical thinkers should always ask these questions when it comes to determining which factual claims are most dependable. What is your proof? Where is the evidence? Are you sure it's true? How do you know that's true? Why do you believe that? And can you prove it? These questions require those making the arguments, which is typically the author and the writer, to be responsible by revealing the basis for the arguments. So basically, even if they're just giving you facts, critical thinkers always need to dig behind them, beyond the facts. Where does this come from? What research was this? How is this proven? Okay, and so that's what we're really trying to get here. Now, I know that a lot of times researchers and put out surveys for people to answer, and these are just some things that I want you to consider when evaluating surveys. While surveys are very beneficial, it gives us a lot of statistics, lots of numbers to help us get a feel of what people think. But there are some flaws when it comes to surveys. And as critical thinkers, it's really important that you are aware of what these flaws are. So sometimes in surveys, in surveys, we cannot assume that all people answer survey questions honestly. So I want you to sort of reflect on your own experience when you have to do a survey. We'd like to think that most people are giving their most accurate and honest answers, but we cannot assume that that happens all the time, okay? Another thing to think about and consider when it comes to surveys is the wording in the survey can be ambiguous. And I say this and I give an example. Like if you see in survey questions that says, do you feel the president is doing a good job? Well, the problem with this survey question is the word good job, okay? What is the definition of good? Good to you might look different from good to me. So because our definition of good is different, then how we answer this question is going to be different, and therefore it really skews the data that is being collected. Another thing to look out for when evaluating surveys is that sometimes surveys have built-in biases. And what I mean when I say built-in biases is in this example that I give you. So let's say this is a survey question that is being asked by people, and see if you can figure out what is the bias in this question. How do you feel about the president's failed response to COVID-19? Right away, you're going to zoom in the word failed. The problem with this question in this survey is that the person who created this question is already making the assumption that the president failed in responding to COVID-19. And so as a person responding to the survey, you don't really get a chance to rebuttal and state that, oh, well, he didn't fail. Now you're thinking, oh yeah, well, how do I feel about his failed responses? What if you didn't feel like he failed? And so therefore the survey is not truly seeking for an objective answer, but has built-in biases. So watch out for those. Another thing to look for or to be careful about is when you look at the survey or you're looking at data from a survey, don't hesitate to actually get your hands on the survey itself, because then look at if the survey is long or short. Now, all of you have done surveys before, and usually when you do a long survey, in the beginning, you typically give your most honest answers in the beginning of a survey, but as the survey drags on and if there are more and more questions, now you're just sort of getting through the survey, and so your answers may be skewed and it may not be as honest. Versus short surveys, people are more willing to take the time to answer them because there are only a few questions and they're willing to give quality answers. So look at the survey. If it's long versus short, it can impact the data that's being collected. And then finally, the recommendation is, as a critical thinker, always examine the survey procedures, how it was done, who was the survey given to, how did people respond to the survey. All of those questions, all of those things impact the final results of surveys. things to consider when evaluating research studies. And I'm going to go over through this very briefly because this is all in chapter 8, but I want to highlight them briefly here. Is just because it is a research does not make it reliable. I know that many times when we make decisions in general, whether it's educational decisions, whether it's decisions about, how to handle COVID-19, everything should be research based, okay? But there are some things that we want to be careful about because not all research have the same level of quality. So you really have to look at the procedure of the research. You have to dig deeper. How was this research done? So just because it's a research, don't think that it is reliable. Some research studies do contradict each other. And so one of the things that researchers try to do to make sure their data is reliable is they replicate the research several times. And if the same results come out to be the same, then we can say that the research is reliable. However, if the research is replicated and the results are different and they contradict each other, then as a critical thinker, you really need to put a pause on that and question the results or the data that is being reported from the research. Another thing to to consider is the purpose of research findings is to not prove conclusions, but really to support conclusions, okay? So there's a difference between proving conclusions and supporting the conclusions, and most of the time, research findings the purpose of it is to support the conclusions. Something else to think about and keep in mind are researchers, okay? Researchers are human. So the people that are carrying out these researchers may have bias, and their bias can interfere with their ability to be objective. So when we talk about bias, we could talk about, maybe their preferences, value preferences, possibly even religion, upbringing. All of these things play a role when it comes to research because researchers are human. And so it's important to know who your researchers are, and would they have the ability and integrity to be objective. Remember that just because facts are found in research, sometimes these facts are no longer relevant. If it's a research that was done 50 years ago, and yes, at that time, those were facts, but those facts are outdated. And so you always want to ask the question, when was this research done? And then finally, considering artificial research versus real world research. And all this is really saying is, look, yes, when you do research, sometimes researches are done in a real world setting, meaning that these are people's, they're studying things that are really happening. It's not set up. It's just everyday life. And then sometimes researchers set up the situation, and so it would be an artificial type of research. And so when you look at these two different types of settings, how do they impact the data? How does it impact the final conclusions of the research? So these are just some things that I want you to be thinking about when you analyze research studies. So we're going to practice analyzing evidence within some passages. And before we go any further, if you have not read chapter 7 and 8, you might feel a little lost on how I'm trying to analyze these evidence. And so as we begin and move forward in this presentation, I'm going to assume that you have read chapters 7 and 8 already, so you understand what I'm trying to do when we do these passages, okay? So I'm going to do some examples with you on how I'm going beyond the facts, how I'm going beyond the statistics and the numbers, and I'm really panning for gold. But when I pan for gold, I'm specifically targeting how authors or researchers are coming up with some of their conclusions that they are coming up with. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video and take a moment to read this passage. And as you're reading this passage, I want you to be thinking about, I want you to look at this passage from a critical thinker's perspective. What are some missing information that you as a critical thinker have? How can the author, the researcher, or the writer prove or explain to you some of the missing information within this research or the numbers that are given to us? So go ahead and pause, take a moment to read this. Okay, so before we get started, I will go ahead and also read the passage so you can follow along and be thinking again about some of the things that you may have noticed when you first read the passage. Are children of alcoholics more likely to be alcoholics themselves? In answering the question, researchers sampled 451 people in Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA, to see how many would say that one or both of their parents were alcoholics. People in AA used in the study currently attend AA somewhere in Ohio, Michigan, or Indiana, and were asked by people in charge of the local AA programs to volunteer to fill out a survey. The research found that 77% of the respondents had at least one parent they classified as an alcoholic. The study also surveyed 451 drinkers randomly from the same states who claimed not to be heavy drinkers. Of the non-heavy drinkers, 23% would label at least one of their parents as alcoholics. So as I read through this, I'm sort of bookmarking and circling and highlighting in my head certain things that stand out to me that I have questions about. And so one of the things that stood out to me was, it says that they surveyed how many would say that one or both of their parents were alcoholics. And one of the issues with this is that I ask, well, what about people that were raised by guardians other than their parents? Will insightful data be left out if we're only looking at people with one or both of their parents? What if they lived with grandma and grandpa? Would that influence them? What if they lived with foster parents or aunts and uncles? And so are we limiting who we are surveying by just including the ones that were raised by parents? Okay. Another thing that stood out to me that I found problematic in this study was that they selected participants or their sample size from only the Midwest regions. Therefore, the results cannot be applied nationally. Only 3 states out of 50 states, they selected people from these 3 states. And so the region limits a true representation of of data or results that can be applied nationally. And then the other issue I had with this when I read this was I found the use of volunteers. So when the research was not able to collect data on people who didn't want to take the survey, meaning that only people who volunteered were, the data revealed what these people felt or thought, but it did not reveal information about people who didn't participate. And so therefore there are some missing insightful information that the research is not able to gather. Another thing that I looked at when I read through this was when they did the second study, and this time they surveyed drinkers randomly, okay, from the same states. So my question that I have is, how do they recruit and select people then? Because when you talk about random, it's kind of like anyone, anywhere. So where did this take place? How do they select these people? How were these people randomly selected? And then also the phrase "who claim." So my problem with this is we don't know how honest these people were. because this is just what they say, that they claim to not be heavy drinkers. So it's their own opinion. And then that also leads to the term heavy drinkers. And this phrase here is ambiguous. Okay, what is heavy to one person is not heavy to another person. So therefore, when these people who claim to not be heavy drinkers, that's their opinion, and other people may not agree with them. So right away, when you look at the summary of this argument and how the research was carried out, there are a lot of missing information in here that as critical thinkers, we really need to dig a little deeper before we can validate this research, before the findings of this research is determined to be reliable or not. Okay, so let's go to another example. Let's do another one together. And I'd like for you to go ahead and pause and then take a moment to read this to yourself. Okay, medical marijuana could be a huge step toward more effectively creating cancer patients. While some people argue that legalizing medical marijuana will increase recreational use of the drug, I argue, where is the proof for such an assertion? Last month, 75 people were surveyed in Detroit, Michigan, and were asked if they believed that legalizing marijuana will increase recreational use of drug in their state. 93% responded that they did not believe legalizing medical marijuana would increase recreational use of the drug. Therefore, our national lawmakers should pass a law legalizing medical marijuana. So when I read through this and I see what the conclusion is, and then how the author came up with this conclusion, what the author used to support that, I have a couple of questions as a critical thinker that I feel that the author needs to include, or they're missing information, okay, in this research here. So one of the things that I notice is it talks about treating cancer patients. What type of cancer are there? Does it treat all cancers, or are there specific types of cancer? And then it also talks about 75 people. So how did they select these 75 people? They never explained that to us. And why only 75 people? Because really, for a research that is supposed to be, a huge controversy, why only 75 people? This seems like a pretty small sample size for this kind of research. And then, of course, Detroit, Michigan. Why Detroit, Michigan? Does Detroit, Michigan represent what America, the population of Detroit, Michigan, is that in a equivalent representation of America? So that was my other question. Why just Detroit, Michigan? And then it stated that 93% of the people who responded did not believe that legalizing marijuana would increase recreational use of drugs. And they used this 93% of what people responded to make a national law, to persuade national lawmakers to pass legalizing medical marijuana. So the issue with this is that when you think about 93% of 75 people, and the author here who's making this argument is basically stating that 70 people who agrees that legalizing marijuana didn't believe that legalizing marijuana would increase recreational use of drugs. They're using 70 people from Detroit to make a national decision. So to me, as a critical thinker, there are lots of flaws with this argument right here. All right, so let's go ahead and try one more together. And I hope that you're starting to catch on to how I am thinking through this as I read through these arguments. I'm again panning for gold, but I'm going beyond the statistic. I'm looking at how were things carried out, the missing information that I need to know to determine if the findings from the research or the argument can be trusted and is reliable. Okay, so go ahead and pause and read this to yourself. I was recently hired to find the best cherry pie recipe in the state of Virginia. I found it in the kitchen of Evelyn Smith. My search began by requesting all interested cherry pie tasters to answer my newspaper ad. All respondents in the state met in a central location and tasted cherry pies. Each of 68 persons tasted the 5 cherry pies that were judged superior at the recent Virginia State Fair. To assure fairness, each taste was made on a different day so that the taste buds would not be confused. The winner, Miss Smith's pie. She received over 40% of the votes, and her closest competitor receives 22%. Apparently, Miss Smith has something special when it comes to cherry pies. Now, what I would like for you to do is go ahead and pause this paragraph of this again, and I want you to try to come up with 2 to 3 evaluation of the information in this passage. What are some questions that you have? What are some flaws that you see that you feel need to be clear before you can determine if this is a valid procedure that was used to determine the best cherry pie in the state of Virginia? So go ahead and pause and see if you can come up with some of them on your own, and then I will go over what some of the issues I found were in this passage. Okay, so some of the things that I looked at when I was reading this and caught my attention was when the author talked about requesting all interested tasters. This means that people who were not interested were not included, and that means it could be leaving out people who know a lot about cherry pies. What if the people that were interested knew nothing about food tasting? And so therefore these are very random people. It's just people who are interested, but it could be people who knows nothing about cherry pies. And that right there can skew the results of the contest. The other thing that stood out to me was how the person put the ad in the newspaper. And we know in today's age, we question who reads the newspaper anymore. So by posting only in the newspaper, many other potential tasters are left out, specifically people who don't read the newspaper. And so you're missing out on a lot of possible tasters that may know about cherry pies that could change the results of the contest. And then it talked about how there were 68 persons tasted that were tasters. Why did they select 68? What was magical about that number? They don't really explain that to us. And then it also says that they selected the 5 cherry pies that were judged superior at the recent Virginia State Fair. So what about the previous winners? What if those pies taste better than the ones in the recent years? So therefore, it's really not the best then. It's just the best within the recent year. And so that makes me question if the results are really the best cherry pie. And then just the whole, procedure itself. There just seems to be so many things wrong with this procedure. What if tasters need to retaste to compare? And then what if tasters have forgotten how the other pies taste? Okay, so there are just so many things wrong with this procedure within itself that I question if the results, Miss Smith having the best cherry pie, is valid. So I hope you are seeing how I'm going through these, and I'm really digging deeper, and I'm asking some questions that I feel need to be answered. And when I go through this process, I can pretty much make a determination as a critical thinker for myself. I don't really think Miss Smith has the best pie in the state of Virginia because there are just way too many things wrong with the way this was carried out. And so that's my conclusion as a critical thinker. And that's what you're trying to do too when you're reading through these things. You're evaluating all of these types of evidence. You're panning for gold, and based on the missing information that the author does not provide, as a critical thinker, you can make the decision for yourself whether this is reliable or not.